Well, happy Tuesday. It's time for this week's video. Get ready. Okay, so this morning we got an email from Wayne Lease in Ontario, Canada. And so I'm going to read you the email. I've already forwarded it to Robertson Mike, but I have a feeling it was too late for this week's Powercast. So let me read it to you. He says, a few thoughts. Everything that came before the gospel was necessary for the completely new wine of the gospel to exist. For man to be created in vanity, the king of vanity was Solomon. Cain and Abel, the law, Joshua into the promised land, all the prophets. And what if there was a transition team needed, the disciples? Jesus lived and taught under the law, filling it full. And finally, Paul is called to unfold the gospel from the scriptures. Thank you all for letting me have a small part in the conversation. Your brother, Wayne Lease. And thanks, Wayne. So let me comment. I like that last part. And what if there was a transition team needed, the disciples? Jesus lived and taught under the law, filling it full. Finally, Paul is called to unfold the gospel from the scriptures. Well, if the disciples were a transition team, I'm not exactly sure what the transition was, because they failed. The disciples basically made they how do I say this? They just inserted Jesus into their Judaism, is really all they did. Their gospel was for the Jews, to the Jews, and they still practiced obedience to the law. And sorry, I've got a gnat. Of course, it's Florida. And so they practiced obedience to the law. And it's not like Jesus didn't try to correct them. You know, Peter, he kept trying to correct Peter many times. You know, he puts him in a trance, lets down a sheet, tells him to eat all this food. Peter says, no, I won't eat anything unclean. God says, don't call anything that I've made clean unclean. And then he sends Peter to a Gentile's house, and Peter starts getting it, and then he forgets it, and I believe due to heavy pushback from James. And so then finally, after the disciples, who were given many clues as to what they were getting wrong, didn't get it right, Jesus called Saul. I did a video one time called Better Call Saul, and it was about this very issue. And it's like Jesus just kind of like, all right, they had their last chance. I'm going to go get somebody who knows the scriptures, and I'm going to deal with him, and because I know he's stubborn and he'll get it. So he calls Saul, and Saul becomes Paul. And Paul, as Wayne says, Paul is finally called to unfold the gospel from the scriptures. And Paul did a very good job. And you can actually tell, even when he's not quoting scripture, he is using symbolic speech that reminds us of scripture. One of them that I think about is when Paul said, Jesus led captivity captive. Now, that was all foretold in the life of Moses. Now, when you look at part of the story of Moses, Moses was symbolic of Jesus, and Pharaoh was symbolic of God, the Father. And Moses, when they get to the Red Sea, Pharaoh's army is coming after all the people, and they stop at the Red Sea, and the people are like, oh no, now we're going to die at the hands of Pharaoh's army. And so they get to the Red Sea, and they're blocked by water. And now water has always been in the Old Testament scriptures. It's been symbolic of death and the grave. And so then Moses lifts up his staff, and the Red Sea parts. And then he leads all of the people, every one of them, through between those waters, through that grave, through that death, and into life on the other side and freedom. And didn't lose a single soul. And then Pharaoh, remember Pharaoh is symbolic of God, Pharaoh's army, his army is his wrath. And Pharaoh's army chases after them into the Red Sea, and all of his army gets swallowed up and destroyed. Like God's wrath got swallowed up and destroyed by the grave that could not hold Jesus. You can also see it in the story of Joseph. Joseph being symbolic of Jesus. And again, in this story, Pharaoh is also symbolic of God the Father. See, Joseph was hated by his people because he told them that one day they would all bow down to him. And so they sold him for some pieces of silver and handed him off to people who were not his own. And while he was with the people who were not his own, he was accused of being guilty of something he was innocent of. He was tried, and he was punished for it, just like Jesus. And then, after a period of time, he's brought to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh makes him lord over all of the kingdom, makes him lord. And when the famine came, all the people in Egypt and all the countries came to Joseph for grain. They bought it, and then they bartered with their cattle and all of their possessions until finally they had nothing left. And they came to Joseph and they said, take our bodies and our land, and we will be the servants of Pharaoh. And so Joseph delivered all of the people in the kingdom and in all the countries into the house of Pharaoh, who is symbolic of God. And Joseph saved everybody. This is the gospel. Jesus is the key. The disciples never got it. The scriptures were no longer a mystery. The mystery was revealed in Jesus. If you view the scriptures in the context purely of Jesus and not of ourselves, the gospel is clear. The foretelling of what Jesus would do, the foretelling of his massive victory, is throughout the scriptures of the Old Testament. The disciples, if they were a transition team, they didn't get it. It's revolutionary, folks. I know. Have a revolutionary week.